Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Joshua Lynn, a visiting fellow at the Center for the Study of Representative Institutions at the MacMillan Center and a lecturer in the History Department. He studies 19th century politics, culture, and political thought in the United States with particular attention to the interaction of race, gender, and conservatism in the antebellum political culture. Today we'll talk with Professor Lynn about his forthcoming book, Preserving the White Man's Republic, the Democratic Party, and the Transformation of American Conservatism from 1847 to 1860. Welcome, Professor Lynn.
Hi, thank you, Marilyn.
Let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Sure. My book is a history of the Democratic Party, the United States Democratic Party in the late 1840s and 1850s, immediately preceding the American Civil War. And I'm interested in charting how this party transitioned into becoming a self-identified conservative party with a set of political ideas they called conservative. And so I examined their political thought, their political ideas, but I also examined their cultural beliefs, especially their attitudes towards gender, race, the family, and the household. And I put those in dialogue. And what I ultimately find is that Democrats in the 1840s and 1850s, they took their traditional dedication to majoritarian democracy, a belief in local grassroots self-government, and they rebranded it as conservative because they were worried that the republic that they had built, which was a republic of political equality for white men, was threatened by a generation of American reformers, especially anti-slavery Americans and other reformers, who they thought would expand the body politic to invite in Americans of color and women. And so they took their dedication to democracy and called it conservative and argued that allowing white men to democratically govern themselves would actually prevent this type of change. It would preserve white men's monopoly of political power. And in the process, they injected democracy into the American conservative tradition and transformed American conservatism.
Okay, so what led you to this topic?
When I was looking through sources, I noticed repeatedly the use of the word conservative, and it was surprising for a group of politicians that had previously not been considered conservative. The Democratic Party, created in the late 1700s by Thomas Jefferson and then sort of re-energized by Andrew Jackson in the early 1800s, was not a conservative party and was not regarded by American conservatives as a conservative party. This was a party that believed in democracy, believed in individual natural rights for white men. That caveat's very important. And believed in other Enlightenment teachings about natural equality for white men, following the principles of thinkers like John Locke. And these were not conservative beliefs, and many American conservatives saw the Democratic Party as the radical party in America, and the Democrats themselves saw themselves as the progressive party. They felt that their mission was to spread egalitarian democracy and political rights for all white men. And so I was struck by, suddenly in the 1840s and 1850s, the use of the word conservative in reference to themselves. And I was curious what that meant. And the topic of conservatism has produced a lot of rich scholarship among American historians and political scientists recently, mostly on conservatism in the 20th century, especially after World War II, trying to account for what's happening in our politics today, the triumph of grassroots electoral conservatism and the new right. So I was curious if any connections could be made between the rich scholarship on 20th century conservatism and these folks in the 19th century who were calling themselves conservatives.
Okay, and how did you do the research for the book?
So I looked at two sets of sources and put them in conversation. I looked at manuscript sources, unpublished writings by Democrats from all walks of life throughout the country in the mid-19th century, so the diaries, letters, unpublished writings, personal recollections, and then I put them alongside more formal published sources, so political treatises, pamphlets, campaign speeches, congressional records, newspapers. And because I was interested in getting at the political thought of an entire party, not a few select individuals, not a few theorists or thinkers, but the party as a whole. And I wanted to cast a wide net, and also including sources like songs, political campaign songs, political cartoons, to get at how these ideas percolated throughout all ranks of the party. And in doing so, I found that what Democrats said, maybe in the legislature, in debates, and on the stump, mirrored what they believed personally and what they wrote about privately to one another, and their political beliefs were rooted in their daily lives and their cultural expectations, their cultural assumptions, their views of themselves as men, as white men, as masters of their households. And I made sure to include both Northern and Southern Democrats, a nationwide study, which hadn't been done before for the Democrats in this period, because the Democrats, even on the eve of the Civil War, managed to hold together a coalition of white men from the slave states and the free states. Even as the nation was about to split over the topic of slavery, they managed to forge this alliance of white men interested in preserving their rights and maintaining their exclusive access to democratic power.
Okay, earlier you had mentioned that things had been different prior to the time period that you're looking at. Can you, what are your thoughts in terms of why things changed to become more conservative?
The party itself becomes more conservative because, to some extent, they felt they had accomplished their animating mission. They had achieved, by the 1840s, they had achieved white male suffrage for all white men in the United States. They had achieved what they considered to be the perfect republic. They often would refer to their republic as perfect, as exceptional. There's a lot of American exceptionalist rhetoric in this era. They called it the happy republic. They had achieved a republic in which all white men had equal rights, could participate fully in decision making, and in which they removed the government from white men's lives to give white men more power and autonomy and power over other Americans. And they also had achieved in foreign policy a continent-wide republic. This is after the Mexican-American War and the conquest of new territory. So they had achieved what they considered, in global terms, a expansive republic and a novel republic, in that they had achieved something that had not been achieved before. Complete democracy, which for them, of course, meant for white men.
Right. So who were some of the players, political players during this time period?
So the political players in this time period are some of sort of the lesser presidents and lesser statesmen. This is the 1840s and 1850s, if you're looking at Democrats, is somewhat this sort of dead period. It's the period between Andrew Jackson and then the ascendancy of Lincoln and the Republicans. And so it hasn't received a lot of attention. It's seen as a time of mediocre politicians. So the Democratic presidents of the 1850s are Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, who are always ranked at the bottom in presidential rankings. And so this is seen as an era in which the party is not as exuberant, not as exciting, not as intellectual as its founding generation with Andrew Jackson and his supporters. So for that reason, it doesn't receive a lot of attention, even though these Democrats were thinkers. They may not have been the best political thinkers, but they are producing a lot of ideas, writing about their thoughts. And there are some who should be reconsidered as important to American political theory, especially someone like Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois, who's one of the most vocal proponents of using democracy as a conservative tool in the 1850s, and he's the one that helps lead this transition.
Okay, so you look at the interaction of things like race and gender. Can you cite some specific examples of how gender and race play into what was going on at that time?
When the Democrats, one of their worst fears was the opening of the political sphere to women and Americans of color. And this is why they switched from their progressive mission of expanding the political sphere once they had included all white men, including ethnic minorities like Irish and German immigrants and Catholics. When they have accomplished that, they then turn to closing off that political sphere. No one else can enter. They felt that any expanding rights further, being even more progressive, would be too radical. And this is the origin of their conservative turn, is this fear that going too far with progress would undermine the rights already achieved for white men. They didn't believe rights could be extended indefinitely. They adhered to Enlightenment teachings about natural rights and natural equality for white men, but not for anybody else. So this is a white supremacist party with very ingrained ideas about race regarding Native Americans and African Americans. And so they felt that the Republic was perfect, and additional tampering with it would only undermine it. And in this era, there's a whole generation of reformers, the anti-slavery movement, the anti-slavery Republican Party, abolitionists, but also temperance reformers, women's rights advocates, health reformers, all of whom Democrats saw as a threat because they would push progress too far and lead the Republic into some sort of radical area that they weren't willing to enter.
And let's talk about some of the other political parties that were active at this time. How different were they, and how did they interact?
So this was an interesting era of intense political change and partisan realignment. The 1840s and the 1850s saw the collapse of the existing American two-party system of Whigs and Democrats. Democrats survived this and are faced with new opponents as their traditional opponents, the Whigs, disintegrate. The Republican Party is the party that emerges victorious and, of course, sets us up for our current political rivalry of Democrats and Republicans. And the Republicans were the anti-slavery party. But also there was a nativist and anti-Catholic party called the Know Nothing Party. And Democrats were terrified of nativism and anti-Catholicism because they regarded immigrants, white immigrants from Germany and Ireland, and Catholics as fellow white men. And they did not want any nativist prescription of their rights. So they fought nativism and they fought anti-Catholicism. So you have this interesting dynamic where you have a white supremacist party that is also strongly in favor of the rights of immigrants, naturalization rights, and the rights of religious minorities, especially Catholics, because they extended the prerogatives of whiteness and political equality to these fellow white men to help build their coalition. So it's a party of slaveholders, it's a party of urban ethnic working men in northern cities, it's a party of Catholics, all of whom saw a common bond in preserving their rights against those who would take away their rights or give their rights to women or African Americans.
Right. So do you think their political values played a role in the Civil War?
The Democrats?
Yes.
Absolutely. They wanted to be the party that could compromise on issues like slavery. They wanted to be, as part of being the conservative party, they wanted to be the party of the Union that could hold the Union together, North and South. And they felt that by appealing to the interests of white men, regardless of whether those white men were Northern or Southern, slaveholders or anti-slavery, Catholic or Protestant, immigrant or native born, that they could achieve this. And this leads them to this sort of hands-off approach to moral issues, where all white men should be able to lead their lives in regards to one issue is temperance, so white men should be able to drink, white men should be able to practice their religion freely, and white men should be able to own other human beings if they wanted to. So this sort of moral, almost relativism was their value.
So basically anything goes, anything a white man wanted to do would be okay.
To a large degree, they run into barriers to what would be the logical extension of their thought. So for example, Mormons in Utah Territory, and the legalization of polygamy, Democrats couldn't stomach that. It was too unpopular in the American electorate. So they would let slaveholders move west and have slavery in new territories, but they wouldn't let Mormons have polygamy. And it's really a logical inconsistency. But so there are some places where they wouldn't go.
Okay. Do you see any similarities in today, basically, in terms of some of the values affecting the politics of today?
I see the Democrats in the 1850s in pioneering this style where you take away power from the government and devolve power to local communities of white men as a conservative tool. I see that as a style that has entered American conservatism, and we see it repeatedly. Their thought process behind this was democracy, which had been considered unstable and radical for centuries as a political, as a mechanism of governance, could be conservative if white men were given democratic power. The assumption was they wouldn't forfeit their power by giving it to others. So they could be trusted to rule themselves through grassroots democracy. And the best example of this, and that has parallels to the present, is this doctrine of what Democrats called popular sovereignty in the 1850s, which was their hallmark political doctrine, which held that white male settlers in federal territories should be the ones who would decide if they would have slavery or not, and if slavery would spread and be legal in new territories like Kansas, like Utah, like New Mexico, Nebraska. And the thought process was, this is conservative because white men on the ground in those places knew their interests better than the elite in DC or reformers or political parties, and they could be trusted to make their own decisions. And they wouldn't be radical because at the end of the day, they have their own rights at stake. And so you see this as a style in American politics continuing to the present. I mean, the current election is being used by some of the supporters of Donald Trump to be taken as a vindication of the people against the know-it-alls in Washington, the elites who said he couldn't win. And so this sort of same rhetoric of devolving power to the people, but it's who would use democracy to conserve something, not to affect change or achieve social justice.
Okay. So ultimately, what do you conclude in the book, and what would you like people to take away from your book?
One of the big conclusions is that democracy can be conservative, and that had not been before, but Democrats pioneered this style, and that democracy, which is often associated with liberalism, with progressivism, with social justice, affecting change. Today,
yes.
But democracy is neutral. Democracy can be anything depending on who wields it. Democracy is pure power, and it can be used for conservative ends. The democratic process can be used to prevent change, to withhold rights, to thwart social justice. And an example today would be regarding rights for LGBTQ Americans in same-sex marriage. This idea that even if the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature all sign off on rights, that there's this higher threshold. The people have to vote on it. And often when the people are invoked to vote on things regarding the rights of LGBTQ Americans, it's on the assumption that they'll vote it down. So even when all branches of government legalize maybe same-sex marriage or extend rights to a certain group, some conservatives can rely on the people. Say, we need to, this is too big an issue for politicians to decide, the people must vote on it. So just as Democrats wanted the people to vote on whether or not African Americans should be enslaved, we have the same style today where the people can be invoked on issues of constitutional rights, where rights and fundamental equality is put up to the electorate, sometimes in hopes that the electorate will not extend those rights. And so I see that as a legacy of the Democratic Party, and as one of the big takeaways of my book is that this is a political style that's been with us for a long time, and that it really should make us rethink our reflexive urge to look at democracy as always a progressive and beneficial mechanism.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Lynn and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.